Thank you, Denis, and thank you for calling me an adult. Some people don't call me that. So thank you for the invitation to come to Bermuda. It's, I think it's minus 35 in Ottawa, where I live. So it's nice to be able to walk around in shorts and not worry about getting frostbite. So I think probably this is the title on the agenda, but I'm probably going to talk about problems and some solutions. I'm not going to be a Debbie Downer all morning. So some of my competing interests are there for you to see. And I'm going to give a little backdrop in terms of the sort of medical industrial complex. It's pretty big, and most people, I think, are not aware of that. I'm going to talk about waste, really, in biomedical research, as I see it, and some possible solutions. And the real kicker is at the end, is how to fund those solutions. And we'll see whether that's possible and whether I can keep you awake for the next few minutes. So medical publishing is a pretty big business. We spend probably $100 to $200 billion a year. That's a lot of money. And we produce about 3 million manuscripts, of which about 50% of those are published. So we already know that 50% of them sort of evaporate. So that's a waste of quite a lot of money, and we can really thank the publishers and editors for that particular problem. And one estimate, certainly by Ian Chalmers and others, is about 85% of this $100 to $200 billion a year is wasted. That's a lot of waste. If I went to IBM and said you're wasting about 85% of your budget, believe me, they'd change pretty quick. But in our profession, we seem quite happy with that. So this is a long-standing problem, and I certainly became aware that in this Jenny Freeman paper, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1978, where she very nicely showed that many authors had committed type 2 errors, declaring no difference between treatments of randomized trials, when in actual fact that their sample size, their trial was too small to detect important observation differences. And so it's still a problem. And what I decided to do is simply just take 2 or 3 papers that were published in 2014. I could probably fill this whole hotel with similar papers, but it would put you to sleep very quickly. So here's a paper, and it's an interesting paper because this is a paper about trials that are funded by the UK National Institutes of Health Research. So these are tax dollars being used to fund trials. And what we see is that the description of the interventions is wholly inadequate. So it really doesn't matter how good the treatment is. And I'm delighted to hear Denis mention, let's get rid of probability values and think of confidence intervals or credible intervals. It doesn't matter how tight they are. If you do not describe your intervention, clinicians cannot use it. It doesn't matter. And here we have taxpayer dollars being used for randomized trials. The input of these tax dollars is a report of a randomized trial where the description of the intervention is inadequate. And even if we move from the world of efficacy, we want to have a look at harms, we see that, well, actually, I've reordered it. So here's an example in Canada. Denis previously spoke about where the primary outcome might differ. We tend to call that selective outcome reporting bias. Here in Canada, this is an examination of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, will be equivalent in the United States of the NIH. If you get a trial funded by CIHR, you can walk on clouds at least for a few hours. And here we find that about 40% of the primary outcome that was funded somehow, mysteriously, does not appear in the results of that funded trial. So again, I'm a taxpayer in Canada, and I can see that my tax dollars are going to enormous waste. And so that's a problem, and I hope it's a problem that most of you will recognize. Again, if we move away from efficacy, we move into the area of harms. We see here an examination of approximately 300 reports, and harms are inadequately reported. So we have both ends of the spectrum, really. We have issues around efficacy, issues around harm that are quite inadequately reported. And a report also, other reports talk about spin, which I think Denis also referred to. And here we have an examination of a good deal of spin in reports of randomized trials which are not statistically significant. The authors still feel compelled to spin their results, to suggest to readers that there is some tantalizing and exciting things going on in the results. Retractions and fraud have increased substantially. Recent estimates, and Stein and al. Have suggested there's a fourfold increase in retractions and fraud. I don't know if any of you are in the field of anesthesia, but certainly in anesthesia there's been two really phenomenal cases in the last 2 or 3 years. Professor Bolt, who is in a German penitentiary at the moment, has retracted 88 articles, of which most of those are randomized trials in a very important area of critical care medicine, of managing people in the ICU. These are not frivolous issues. There's also a very similar case in Japan of a retraction of 39 reports. And I'm not going to bore you with the anesthesia cases, because I realize that most of you are not in anesthesia, but they are simply two recent highlights of the problem of fraud. So what's interesting here is that we fail to really mention is that these are all based on published papers. All of these problems are based on published papers, which means that they have passed peer review and journal editors. They haven't somehow crept into the system. They have, across the board, passed through peer review and passed through editors. And this is an area, the inadequate reporting of research is really across the spectrum of biomedical research. It's not particular to nutrition, it's not particular to animal studies, it's particular to every single area. And so, I'm sure many of you know of the recent spoof article in Science, where they made up an article, a fictitious article, and they sent it to approximately 300 journals, and they have some very fascinating results. And I want to just draw your attention to, about 250 got through the whole process, and of those, here are papers accepted. And the inner circle, about 50% of papers accepted received no peer review. Okay, so this is not a particularly uncommon problem. We are now in the era of predatory journals. These journals are not particularly interested in science, but are particularly interested in making lots and lots of money. So you can get anything published. It's not a problem to get things published anymore. And also the lay press has become very interested in how we are getting things messed up a little bit. Recently, The Economist had some nice pieces on how science goes wrong. And Trish Groves, who's the deputy editor at BMJ and the editor-in-chief of BMJ Open, indicated that journals, some of which have been in the business of reporting research for many decades, are still not producing articles that are clear enough to really judge a study's conduct, quality, and importance, let alone to allow other researchers to reproduce and build upon it. And so the last part is quite interesting, because I'm a systematic reviewer, and I need to be able to read clear and transparent reports of primary research if I'm going to use systematic reviews. And systematic reviews are important because, at least in Canada, I'm not sure in the United States, much of medical practice is based on practice guidelines. And a good practice guideline is always going to start with a systematic review. So it is a problem and a big problem. So the recent Nobel laureate of medicine described the Lancet, Cell, and Nature described them as luxury journals, and I thought that was kind of cute. So one of these luxury journals has had a series that came out on the 8th of January called Increasing Value and Reducing Waste. And it was a series, here's the series of 5 papers, and I'm not sure whether you can get it open access from the Lancet, but it's all on various aspects of perhaps how to improve the situation of publishing on doing biomedical research. And so there's really 5 phases to this, and it starts with sort of asking the right questions. Are we asking the right questions? And I think perhaps Denis alluded to some of this. Have we used the right methods? And what I'm going to focus on here is unbiased and usable research reports. Where are we with that game? And so this is the paper, Reducing Waste from Incomplete and Unusable Reports of Biomedical Research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some issues to do with this paper. So I mentioned that about 85% of it is biomedical research is wasted. The good news is that much of it is correctable. It is possible for us to change our behavior. And now I'm going to spend really the rest of my few minutes talking about what I think are some of the possible solutions. And 4, I want to talk about are issues around journal endorsement and implementation of reporting guidelines. I'm just going to follow up on one of the slides that Denis mentioned about reporting guidelines. Developing core competencies for editors and peer reviewers against which both groups can be trained, certified, and participate in the continuing sort of medical education activities or editor education activities, really entrenching peer review within academic institutions and introducing a new professional, what I would call as a publication officer. So I'm a little bit about journal endorsement and implementation of reporting guidelines, and sort of what are reporting guidelines. And essentially they're checklists, and they're really to help authors remember what to tell the reader, and also to help peer reviewers about what to look for in reports of research. And there are lots of reporting guidelines, and if you go to the Equator Network, you'll see over 200 reporting guidelines for a very, very wide a variety of types of research. And they have a internet presence, and they also have a library where you can find most of these reporting guidelines, and you can access all of this information free. Absolutely no problem to get any of this information. And they have lots of toolkits to help authors, peer reviewers, and editors. And so one might ask, I think very reasonably, do reporting guidelines work? Namely, do they improve the quality of reporting? And I think endorsement is quite a complicated issue that we tend to overlook in detail. And what we've done is to have a look and see, basically, is the quality of reporting higher in journals that endorse reporting guidelines compared to journals that do not endorse reporting guidelines. And so here's an example. It's a bit of a complicated example, but it sort of gets at one of the points that Denis had mentioned about randomization. So randomization is a 2-stage process. The first phase is sequence generation, and once the sequence has been generated, the second phase is allocation concealment. So what we were quite interested in knowing as an example is, in terms of randomized trials, is that in journals that endorse the CONSORT statement, is sequence generation better reported than in journals that do not endorse the CONSORT statement. And we have very clear evidence here that indeed it does. And I could go through each of the items on the CONSORT statement, and we get some encouraging results. And for those of you who are interested, you can go and see that systematic review. And there is very nice evidence also. Eric Cobo, who's done a very nice randomized trial looking at actually whether reporting guidelines actually help peer reviewers in terms of doing their job. And I think the evidence is quite strong, and at least in this trial, the use of reporting guidelines appears to be quite effective, also for peer reviewers, and that's, I think, important as well. So the question is how best to endorse and implement a reporting guideline. And there are lots of ways to do it. If you go to the CONSORT or PRISMA website, you can see an example of how we recommend editors endorse. The analogy in clinical medicine might be to say, I want you to take your low-dose aspirin. And there are ways of sort of saying to a patient, I want you to take your low-dose aspirin. You can be vague, or you can be quite clear and quite strong. And it's also true for reporting guidelines. So many journals are unsure how to do that. Also, the notion of developing core competencies for editors and peer reviewers. I've looked hard, and maybe I haven't looked hard enough, but I cannot find any documentation or any evidence on what are core competencies that all editors should have and peer reviewers. So we seem to be operating in a very strange world. When I got on the airplane to come here to Bermuda, I perfectly well knew that the pilot on that plane had some core competencies of which he or she were trained against. But yet we can spend billions and billions of dollars running thousands and thousands of journals, and there appears to be very, very few core competencies that I can see that editors and peer reviewers should have. Nor can I see a consensus opinion, for example, on the World Association of Medical Editors, or the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, as to what core competencies editors and peer reviewers should have. We don't know what they are. We know that editors are not trained. We know that editors certainly are not certified. And we know that editors do not have a continuing editor education. What's the latest and greatest in open access? What's the difference between gold and green open access? How many editors know this? Is it relevant? What do we know about outcome selective reporting bias, et cetera, et cetera? And publishers ought to display this information. They ought to be very proud that their editors have a certain standard. And so for the physicians in this room, they will be very familiar. Most physicians are trained against a set of core competencies to which they're examined. Some of them pass their examination or are certified to split your sternum and take out your heart, to give you chemotherapy or whatever it is. And yet we seem to have a complete lack of this in the whole world of editing and peer review. And I'll talk a little bit more. Here is just a slide to also focus on the notion of peer reviewers. It seems to me peer reviewers are in a similar boat. I know certainly I did receive no training on how to be a decent peer reviewer. And based on some of the peer reviews I've received, I often wonder whether people who are peer reviewing some of my work with some added ingredients to their bloodstream. And I want to talk for a moment on entrenching peer review within academic institutions. I certainly, in the university that I belong to, and I have surveyed universities everywhere I go, I cannot see any training of peer review entrenched in the academic system. And I think that is absolutely sinful and hugely wasteful. How can we expect the next generation to do any better than currently if we don't train people? It's really quite strange. And I think academic institutions need to take the lead here and actually demand some courses in their settings. I do want to talk a moment about what I call as a publication officer. I know at least in Canada, and I suspect the same in the US because I have many colleagues who I've asked, is there are significant resources at the front end. Certainly in my institution, we have several what we would call grants officers, people who are helping scientists locate where the dollars are, how to complete the application, and all sorts of things. And they're quite interested in peer reviewing or examining the application before it's submitted. So I think institutions are quite good at that. And they seem to be remiss at the back end, once the research is done, what's available at institutions. Certainly in my institution, we could hire a medical writer, that's possible to do, but they're not entrenched in our system. And if you want to do that, you need the dollars to go and do it. And I propose that we create positions of what I would call a publications officer. And I think this person really could have many roles and responsibilities, some of which I have put here, but it's by no means a complete list, and it may not be the best list. But I do believe that we need to invest quite heavily at the back end of once the research is done, is helping the researchers get it into such a shape that it's what I would call fit for purpose. I would like to end with just a few slides to note that in the Declaration of Helsinki 2008, and I know it's been updated in 2013, and I have not yet had time to see whether there's any substantive changes in this area, but certainly editors are not meeting their ethical obligations in terms of the Declaration of Helsinki of ensuring that the quality of what they produce is good. And also the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is a wonderful resource, that editors have an obligation to ensure the quality of the material they publish is of high standard. And I think based on a very small sampling of what I've shown you this morning, and a much, much bigger trough of what's out there, is editors are really failing on both counts, and we need to work extremely hard to improve that situation. The issue is how to fund these activities, and many organizations, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which I think is set up quite similar to the United States NIH, is already almost funded in disease silos. So there's cardiovascular, there's cancer, et cetera, et cetera. And when you go and you say to them, well, you know, we're not interested in looking at this in cancer because selective reporting bias is not an issue of cancer and nutrition, it's across the board. And they just repeatedly turn you down. And even if you can get funded, it's usually very short term, 1 to 2 years perhaps. And more long-term funding is required. This is a bigger problem, it's going to need a longer time to resolve. And I think the groups to do that are granting agencies and publishers. And so, for example, we need to, I think, put a lot of pressure on both groups to indicate that what they're doing currently is highly wasteful. From a purely fiscal perspective, it's highly wasteful. Obviously, from a scientific basis, it's also hugely wasteful. So in our paper, we discuss in 3 recommendations in terms of how possibly to fund this. And I'm not going to waste your valuable time with going into any of the detail. You can certainly have a look at those Lancet papers and see what you think for yourself. I think then that is me done. So thank you.